Argentina's inflation rate is 271%. That's a crazy number. And to put into perspective just how catastrophic that inflation rate is, the worst inflation the United States experienced during the peak of the cost of living crisis, when people were struggling to afford food, was just 9.1% in June of 2022. For Argentina, though, 271% isn't even an especially unique situation. The highest inflation that Argentina has ever experienced is a whopping 20,262.8%, and that was in March of 1990. If we had inflation that high, a £1.50 chocolate bar would cost £350 by the end of the year. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Argentina's economy has been a continuous disaster since the 1970s. And in addition to all of the problems with inflation, Argentina has defaulted on its national debt 9 times. But it wasn't always like this. There was a point when Argentina had one of the most impressive economies in the world. Argentina benefited from a massive post-independence economic boom driven by increased agricultural output. Its exports increased by 4.5% annually from 1810 to 1850 and by 7 to 8% annually between 1850 and 1870. This growth rate came from the expansion of Argentina's frontier into the fertile pampas, where improvements in livestock production transformed cattle into a booming industry. Cattle farming and other agricultural products benefited from a remarkable 377% improvement in the terms of trade from 1810 to 1825. In plain English, what that means is that the goods Argentina was exporting, mainly beef, became more expensive while the goods that Argentina was importing, like textiles, got cheaper. So they have this massive boost to the economy because the products that they produce and sell are selling very well for a high price on global markets. And all of this was like putting jet fuel into the Argentinian economy. And by 1913, Argentina's per capita wealth was among the highest in the world. So where did all of this go wrong? How does an economy that's outperforming basically all of the others collapse so badly and for such a long, persistent portion of its history? The problems that would plague Argentina's economy in the 20th and 21st centuries, namely debt and currency instability, were present from its first moments as a country. When Argentina achieved its independence from Spain in 1816, it had already accumulated a massive war debt. The government of the newly founded state then proceeded to borrow heavily to invest in infrastructure projects. In one famous, ill-thought-out deal, the government borrowed £570,000 from Baring Brothers, a bank in London, with the promise that they would repay £1 million, so almost twice the amount that they had borrowed. And to finance government spending and cover debts, the government decreased its currency several times in the 1800s. The state devalued the peso papel, first in 1827 by 33% and again in 1829 by 68%. So these early forays into printing money to finance spending and debt were only a taste of what was to come in the period from 1977 to 1990, a period dramatically named the Great Unraveling. And this is where things begin to go really, really wrong for the Argentinian economy. In 1976, a military dictatorship seized control of the government in a coup against the presidency of Isabel Perón. Democracy was suspended and political parties were banned. The military conducted a brutal anti-communist campaign called the Dirty War, during which an estimated 22,000 to 300,000 people were killed or disappeared. In addition to just being generally awful, the dictatorship also racked up a massive amount of government debt to finance yet more spending on infrastructure projects and to fund its brutal anti-communist campaign. Unsurprisingly, the explosion of government spending coincided with the first real deregulation of banking and lending in Argentina and in the world. So Argentina would go from having a really small number of domestic banks in the 40s and 50s to a massive financial sector that's highly leveraged in the 90s, 70s, and 80s. And what this financial sector allows Argentina to do is basically borrow money to finance more government spending. If we don't have this deregulation of the financial sector, they're not able to acquire as much debt as they end up doing. At the same time, we get this big spike in global oil prices because of the Arab oil embargo. Basically, a lot of Arabic states, in response to US foreign policy, banned the export of oil from their countries to specific other countries, and this increases global oil prices by a bunch. Now, this is a problem for people in all parts of the world, but it's specifically a problem in Argentina because Argentina doesn't have access to any domestic oil reserves. So this government, in addition to all this spending on government infrastructure, all this spending on their dirty war, also has to borrow a large amount of money to pay for very expensive oil so that the economy can grow and industrialize. And all of these factors together cause public debt to explode in Argentina. So from 1975 to 1982, the debt grows by 30% each year, partly because of the continued government spending and partly because of penalties and fees for failing to keep on top of debt payments. So much like if you've got credit card debt and you've got to meet a minimum monthly payment, otherwise you get fined, governments will have similar terms attached to the debt that they borrow. And if you don't make those payments, you get penalized just the same. So in 1982, the Argentinian government defaults, right? They tell their creditors that they won't be able to pay them back, and Argentina is effectively cut off from international lending. Basically, this means the government can't borrow any more money to finance its excessive spending. So up until this point, they've been going to international lenders to borrow money, but because they've told their existing lenders, we're not going to pay you back, that means that other lenders aren't willing to give them money. You know, if you've defaulted on a mortgage, if you've said, I'm not able to pay off this mortgage, you're going to really struggle to get another mortgage from a bank. And Argentina has a very similar problem. They've defaulted, and now it's very hard for them to borrow on international markets. The one positive out of this default and out of this situation is that the default, combined with the loss of the Falklands or the Malvinas, depending on your political persuasions, to the UK, forces this military junta to relinquish power and hold democratic elections. But the default hasn't really made these economic problems go away. Just because they've said they're not going to pay their creditors back, Argentina is still spending more money than it's getting in tax revenue. And the new democratic government needs to rebuild democracy without any access to international borrowing. So the government turns to the only two sources of funding it can access: borrowing from its own domestic banks, often at these horrifically inflated interest rates, because the government has few alternatives, or it turns to just straight up printing money, right? So it will print money from its presses, and then it will go to whoever it needs to pay, whether that's nurses or teachers or construction companies, and it will give them the money that it has printed. So instead of borrowing, it's just making its own money and using that to pay for stuff. And to underpin just how crazy this economic situation gets, in the 1980s, by 1989, 90% of Argentina's domestic lending capacity is dedicated to financing the government. So if you think about, all of the banks in a country and all the money that they're lending out in credit cards, in loans, in mortgages, in business loans, in overdrafts, 90% of all of that money is going directly to the government. So the government's borrowing it. People who are getting mortgages are not borrowing it. So that's showing just how skewed this domestic source of financing is because Argentina can't access these foreign lenders. And printing all of the new money to try and cover government spending brings on Argentina's first or second, depending on how you evaluate it, but its first real period of hyperinflation, which starts in 1985. And inflation rates during this period are regularly in the hundreds or 200s of percentage points annually, right? So each year, your inflation rate is going up by, say, 150% or 210% throughout this period. And that's compared, again, compare that to the inflation rates we've experienced recently in the UK, or the inflation rates that have been present in the United States, where we've been looking at rates of sort of 9 or 10% at the very worst. Argentina during this period has inflation rates in the hundreds. And this whole time, the rate of inflation is being kept within the bounds of human comprehension, right? So this sort of 270% rate, because the government is engaged in protracted negotiations with the IMF, so this is the International Monetary Fund, to try and access other sources of financing and restore investor confidence. So they're trying really hard to find a way back to being able to borrow from international lenders, and they're negotiating with the IMF to try and do that. The other thing the government's doing at this point to try and keep inflation, again, not at a reasonable level, but sort of from spiraling completely out of control is that they're using their foreign currency reserves to try and keep the value of the peso as high as possible. So what they're doing is, if they've got any US dollars or euros on hand in the economy, they're using those to buy their own currency, which should increase the price of that currency, right? Because you're sort of creating demand for it, you're taking it out of circulation. So at the same time that they're printing all this new money, which is causing inflation, they're trying to use whatever foreign currency they do have to try and keep inflation under control. But in 1989, these talks with the IMF, they collapse, right? Like, the government cannot reach an acceptable deal with the IMF. And mainly this is because the IMF is requesting a lot of austerity policies, cutbacks in government spending that the government isn't willing to commit to politically. And this is when things start to go horrifically wrong for Argentina's economy. That same year, there are these riots that start in Rosario, the third largest city in Argentina. And they spread to the rest of the country in response to rising prices and a national food shortage. So people can't afford to eat anymore, right? Because they've had these crazy increases in pricing. And they just start looting stores, and this spreads throughout the country. In all the chaos, 14 people die, and more than 100 are injured. And this default that happens in 1989 and the collapse of the talks and all these riots, they force the President Alfonsín from government, and he's replaced by a successor called Carlos Menem. And Carlos promises to restore stability through price controls and exchange controls. Basically, he's going to limit how much prices can go up. But these policies, which are initially received well, they're an absolute disaster. They don't work at all. They do nothing to stop the rates of inflation, because by this point it's completely beyond the control of the government. And what's worse is that Argentina has run out of foreign currency reserves. Investors are panicking because of the collapse of negotiations with the IMF, and the handbrake is completely removed from hyperinflation. Basically, the Argentine government has no tools left to try and keep inflation under control. Without access to any foreign currency, there's no way for them to keep the peso at a reasonably high value. And this is when inflation hits its absolute peak, the highest it will ever be in Argentina's history. In March of 1990, this is when we get that 20,262% annual inflation rate. Argentina defaults again in 1989, making this the second time in a decade that Argentina has declared itself unable to pay its foreign debts. The government is eventually able to get inflation under control by enacting a peg. This is a really extreme measure. Basically, they say, by law, the Argentine peso is worth $1. And for now, the immediate problem is solved, right? So the government is, at tremendous cost, legislated inflation away. But this pattern is going to keep coming back. It's going to recur. And the economic problems that Argentina has experienced during this period of really extreme inflation, they keep cropping back up. Argentina has another bout of hyperinflation in the early 2000s, and again, we're experiencing rates of hyperinflation now, where we have annual inflation rates in the hundreds of percentage points. Argentina will again default on its debt in 2001, 2014, and 2020. So, on the whole, this is a recurring issue that's never really gone away. The problems of government spending and inflation and a lack of access to borrowing. And the common explanations that you'll hear for why Argentina is so screwed up, that we have poor economic management or that the government is spending recklessly, they do make sense when you look at what's happened in Argentina's economy. But for me, it's an unsatisfactory explanation for why Argentina has these economic problems. Yes, Argentina's government borrowed more money than they should have, but so did countries like Brazil and Mexico, who also survived the Latin American debt crisis. So I think the fundamental question here is, why are the outcomes so much worse for Argentina compared to other countries that also have high levels of government debt in the region? And conventional wisdom would say that the problem that Argentina has is that it has too much debt. But actually, the size of Argentina's debt isn't too bad when you compare it to other countries. So one way to measure the size of a country's debt is to look at something called the debt to GDP ratio. So this is if you took the total amount of public debt that a country owed and compare it to the size of the economy for a given year and take that as a percentage. So if you have a debt to GDP ratio of 80%, that's a larger debt burden compared to if you have a debt to GDP ratio of 30%, for example. And it becomes harder to manage because really you want to understand the size of a country's debt in terms of the size of its economy. So Argentina's debt to GDP ratio is 69.5%. By comparison, if you look at the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom, the debt to GDP ratio is 85.6%, so meaningfully higher. And then also, if you look at the United States, they've got a debt to GDP ratio of 123%, which is, it's almost twice the debt to GDP ratio of Argentina. And when we think about countries like the US and the UK, we don't think that they're drowning in, completely destructive levels of government debt. Maybe we think they should have lower government debt, but they're able to manage their debt burden. And for fiscal deficits too, Argentina is performing pretty well. So fiscal deficit is basically the gap between the amount of money you're spending and the amount of money you bring in tax revenue. And again, you can kind of measure this compared to the size of the economy as a percentage. So a higher percentage of fiscal deficit means you're spending more money than you're bringing in. Argentina has a fiscal deficit of 2.9% of GDP. By comparison, the UK has a fiscal deficit of 4.4%, and in the US it's 6.3%. So again, like the amount of money that the Argentina is spending year on year compared to its tax revenue, it's not much worse than many other countries around the world. So for me, neither the fiscal deficit nor the overall size of Argentina's debt are the main problem. The problem is that they've got this CCC credit rating, which makes them the lowest rated borrower in international markets, aside from countries like Ethiopia and Ghana, which are in selective default. So they're actively defaulting on some of their debts. The only other country with a credit rating that's as bad as Argentina is Ukraine, which is obviously currently fighting off a Russian invasion and going into tremendous amounts of debt to do that. So because Argentina's defaulted 9 times in its history, it's got a really terrible credit rating, meaning that basically people are very unwilling to lend to Argentina, and if they do, they're going to expect extremely high interest rates. So despite modest debt levels, Argentina's rating is so poor because it's defaulted 9 times. If you as an individual declared bankruptcy 9 times, no one's going to give you a mortgage, and countries aren't that different in terms of international borrowing. So a poor track record throughout its history is probably the main problem. The reason such a poor credit rating makes it difficult for Argentina to borrow money to pay off existing creditors. This is something called debt servicing. So if you've got a credit card again, you're expected to pay a minimum monthly payment. And the same thing is true for government debt, right? There will be terms that you're expected to pay off a certain amount of the debt on an annual or quarterly basis. And if you can't borrow the money to meet your debt servicing needs, the only option the government really faces is to try and print that money so that it can pay off. And so there's this sort of built-in incentive, or built-in need really, because they can't borrow the money to print it in order to pay off the debt servicing costs. And it creates a really strong incentive to fund government spending with printing as opposed to borrowing, and that's going to make inflation worse. So the more you're printing money into your economy, the more you're increasing the amount of your currency that floats about, and this is going to increase prices and decrease the value of your currency. So that's how you get inflation, is you've massively increased how much of your currency exists in the economy. And then I think you want to look at why then has Argentina defaulted 9 times? And I think you can put that down to economic mismanagement, but I think there are other factors that you want to pay attention to really understand what's going on here. One is that Argentina's public debt is structured in a way that's much more short-term than the debt of other countries. So to sort of illustrate what I mean here, let's imagine that I owe £300,000 personally. Now, if that money I owe on a mortgage, I'm actually okay financially because I'm being expected to pay that mortgage off over the course of 30 years. I've got plenty of time to make monthly payments and pay the total amount of money off over a 30-year period. However, if I owe that $300,000 to someone who's going to expect me to pay it in a week's time, that's going to be a massive problem because I can't come up with the money needed to pay them off in that week. And what I have to then do is I have to go and try and borrow the money in order to give that money back to someone over the weekend, right? So I've got to find someone else to give me £300,000 so I can pay the first lender off. And the problem is, if you're Argentina, that's very expensive. It's very expensive to go and borrow money in order to pay back or meet your minimum payments on your debt. And a lot of Argentina's debt that they've borrowed is short term. So they have to pay stuff off sooner than other countries do. And this also makes it much more difficult for them to manage how they're paying that debt off, because it does mean that they're going to have to borrow more money more regularly in order to pay the debt off. And also the other part of this that's really significant is that Argentina's developed a really poor relationship with international institutions that might be able to help them avoid defaulting. So institutions like the International Monetary Fund that are supposed to come in and provide financial assistance to countries that are struggling to make payments. But the IMF has become the sort of the scapegoat or the legitimate enemy, depending on your perspective, of the Argentinian people. It's extremely unpopular, and they primarily blame the IMF for most of their economic problems. But this means then that it's very politically difficult for governments to reach an agreement with the IMF that would actually allow them to be able to more effectively pay off their debt. So you're way more likely to default as a result of that, and then your credit rating just gets worse. Another issue that we have here in Argentina is that the currency instability makes it increasingly difficult for repaying debt. So if I have really high rates of inflation and my currency is losing value, if I have to pay off debt that's, say, $100,000 and my currency keeps losing value, then over time, the amount of money I have to come up with to pay off that debt also keeps growing at the same rate of inflation. So let's say that, I owe $10,000 in a year's time. And right now I have, let's say 100,000 pesos that are worth $10,000. But I know I've got a really high inflation rate. And by the end of the year, it's actually going to be 200,000 pesos to that $10,000. So instead of having to come up with 100,000 pesos, I'm actually by the end of the year going to have to come up with 200,000 pesos. So a lot of the problems Argentina has kind of reinforce each other. The worse your inflation is, the harder it is for you to meet payments using your currency. And again, the worse your inflation is, the less confident investors are lending you money, which makes it harder for you to pay off your existing investors when those bills come due. And that's going to make it more likely that you default, which will hurt your credit rating, and then again make it even more difficult for you to go and borrow money. So once they've got themselves into this position where you have an awful credit rating, it doesn't matter anymore that their debt actually isn't that big, because they don't have access to the tools that most countries have to be able to manage and service their debt properly. And that, I would argue, is the core problem that Argentina has, not the size of the debt, not reckless government spending, but rather a lack of credit and a lack of access to the tools that economies normally have to be able to manage their debt.